I never expected that a simple request from a neighbor would completely upend my life. But that's exactly what happened. It wasn't a cup of sugar or a spare key he needed. No, it was something far more personal, a request that breached the unspoken boundaries of apartment living and sent my carefully ordered world into a tailspin. But let me take you back, because to understand the significance of that moment, you have to understand the quiet, predictable rhythm of my life before he knocked on my door. My name is Miles. At the time, I was 28 and worked from home as a freelance user interface designer. My life was a neat collection of routines nested inside other routines. I woke up at 7, meditated for 10 minutes, made coffee with an AeroPress using beans I ordered from a small roaster in Oregon, and was at my desk by 8. My apartment was my sanctuary and my office, a minimalist space of cool grays and warm woods overlooking a perpetually damp city street. It was a life I had designed, much like one of my user interfaces, to be clean, efficient, and free of unnecessary friction. It was also, if I was being completely honest with myself, a little bit lonely. I had friends, of course, people I saw for trivia nights or weekend hikes, but my day-to-day existence was a solitary one. I found a certain comfort in the silence, in the ability to control my environment completely. But there were moments, usually late at night, when the blue light of my monitor was the only thing illuminating the room, that a profound sense of isolation would creep in. It was a dull ache, a quiet longing for a connection that felt deeper than a scheduled social event. I'd gotten so used to it that it felt like a permanent part of my internal landscape, like a low-grade hum you only notice when it suddenly stops. My apartment building was an old brick structure, the kind with thick walls that mostly muffled your neighbors' lives, but occasionally let through the bass line of a song or the frantic barking of a dog. I lived on the third floor, Unit 3B. For the first 2 years, the occupant of 3A was a quiet, elderly woman who smelled of lavender and baked bread on Sundays. Then, she moved to be closer to her daughter, and for a few weeks, the unit was silent and empty. I didn't think much of it until the moving truck arrived on a Saturday. That was the first time I saw Caleb. I was coming back from my morning run, sweaty and tired, just as he was wrestling a large, awkward-looking floor lamp out of the truck. He was tall, with broad shoulders and arms that spoke of serious time spent at a gym. His dark hair was short and messy, and he had the kind of easy, unforced confidence that I always found both magnetic and intimidating. He glanced up, saw me fumbling for my keys, and gave me a quick, friendly smile. It was a simple, neighborly gesture, but it sent a jolt through my system that was entirely out of proportion to the event itself. In my mind, I immediately placed him in a very specific category: the handsome, effortlessly charming, and undoubtedly straight guy. He was the kind of man who played sports on the weekend, drank beer with a large group of friends, and dated women who were just as beautiful and confident as he was. He was, in short, the exact opposite of me. My world was internal, digital, and meticulously curated. His, I imagined, was external, physical, and gloriously spontaneous. He was a creature from a different ecosystem, one I could observe from a safe distance, but never truly enter. Over the next few weeks, our interactions were limited to the typical neighborly dance. A nod in the hallway, a shared moment of frustration waiting for the ancient elevator, a quick hello at the mailboxes. Each time, he was friendly and open. He learned my name, remembered I worked from home, and once held the main door for me when I was juggling a precarious load of groceries. They were tiny, insignificant moments, but my lonely brain cataloged each one, turning them over and examining them for hidden meaning that almost certainly wasn't there. I learned small things about him. He worked in construction, which explained his physique and the fact that he was often out of the apartment before I was even having my first cup of coffee. He had a younger sister he was close with. I heard him on the phone with her once in the hallway, his voice softening as he teased her about her new boyfriend. He was, by all accounts, just a nice, normal guy living his life. But for me, he became a kind of quiet fascination. He was a splash of vibrant color in my otherwise monochrome existence. The sound of his key in the lock next door became a familiar part of my day, a small, grounding reality check that there was another life unfolding just a few inches away from my own. I was perfectly content, I told myself, to keep him at that safe, observable distance. I was wrong. The inciting incident, The moment that shattered the comfortable distance I had maintained came on a Tuesday morning. It was just after 9, and I was deep in concentration, mapping out the user flow for a new mobile application. The rain was drumming a steady, soothing rhythm against my window pane. It was a perfectly normal, unremarkable day until a sharp, frantic knock echoed from my front door. It wasn't the polite rap of a delivery person. It was urgent, insistent. I pulled off my headphones, my heart giving a little jump of surprise. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was that there was some kind of emergency in the building, a fire alarm that I hadn't heard. I got up and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. My breath caught in my throat. It was Caleb, but it wasn't the composed, confident Caleb I was used to seeing. His face, or what I could see of it, was contorted in a mask of comical distress. The entire right side of his face was covered in a thick layer of white shaving cream, while the left side was clean-shaven, but for a small, bleeding nick on his jawline. His hair was damp and sticking up in odd directions. He looked completely flustered. I unlocked and opened the door, 100 questions running through my mind. "Caleb, is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He ran a hand through his damp hair, looking profoundly embarrassed. "Miles, man, I am so sorry to bother you," he started, his voice a rushed tumble of words. "This is going to sound insane, but my razor, it broke. Mid-shave. The head just snapped right off." He gestured helplessly at his half-foamed face. "I've got this really important meeting with a new client in less than an hour, and I look like a complete idiot." I just stared at him for a second, taking in the absurd image he presented. The frantic energy coming off him was palpable. It was such a strange, vulnerable position to see him in, so different from the easygoing guy I'd constructed in my head. A part of me, the part that craved order and recoiled from unexpected intrusions, wanted to just apologize and close the door. But the other part, the lonely part that was so fascinated by him, saw an opening, a crack in the wall between our two separate worlds. "Oh, wow," I said, my mind finally catching up. "That's bad timing." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You're telling me. I don't suppose, and I feel like a total mooch for even asking. But do you have a spare razor I could borrow? Just for, this side." He pointed to the still lathered half of his face. "I'll buy you a whole pack to replace it." I'm just in a major bind. The request hung in the air between us. It was so mundane, so simple, and yet it felt significant. It was a request for help, an admission of fallibility. It was a bridge. My apartment, my meticulously controlled sanctuary, was about to be breached. My heart was pounding, a mixture of anxiety and a strange, thrilling excitement. This was not part of the routine. This was chaos. This was a man with half a face full of shaving cream standing in my doorway. And for some reason, all I could think was, yes. "Yeah, of course," I heard myself say, my voice sounding much calmer than I felt. "Come on in. Let me see what I have." I stepped back, holding the door open, and Caleb, with a look of immense relief, crossed the threshold into my apartment and into my life. I led him into my small, spotlessly clean bathroom. It felt surreal, having him there. He seemed to fill the entire space, his broad shoulders making my perfectly adequate bathroom feel suddenly tiny. The air, which usually smelled of my eucalyptus and mint body wash, was now filled with the classic, masculine scent of his shaving cream. He stood awkwardly by the door as I opened my medicine cabinet, my hands feeling clumsy and slow. I was hyper-aware of his presence behind me, of his gaze on my back. "I use a cartridge razor," I explained, pulling out a fresh, unopened pack. "Is that okay? I think I have a spare handle, too." I tried to keep my tone light and casual, as if handsome, half-shaved neighbors asking for emergency grooming supplies was a regular occurrence. Caleb leaned forward slightly to see, and for a moment, his arm brushed against mine. It was nothing, a fleeting contact, but a current of electricity shot up my arm, making the fine hairs stand on end. I fought to keep my breathing even. "That's perfect, actually. Same kind I use," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "You are a legitimate lifesaver, Miles. I owe you big time." I fumbled with the plastic packaging, finally freeing a new cartridge and snapping it onto my spare handle, which was identical to my own. I passed it to him, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second longer than necessary as he took it. Or maybe I imagined that part. I was an expert at inventing significance where there was none. Here you go, I said, my voice a little too quiet. He took the razor and turned to my mirror, leaning over the sink. I hovered by the doorway, unsure of the proper etiquette for this bizarre situation. Should I leave? Should I stay? Leaving felt rude, like I was kicking him out. Staying felt voyeuristic. I opted for a middle ground, leaning against the doorframe and pretending to be busy examining a loose thread on my shirt. I watched his reflection in the mirror as he carefully drew the razor down his cheek, carving a clean path through the foam. He was concentrating, his brow furrowed slightly. In that moment, stripped of his usual easy confidence and focused on such a simple, human task, he seemed different, more accessible. The intimidatingly handsome neighbor was replaced by just a guy who had a bad morning and needed a little help. We fell into a surprisingly easy conversation as he finished the shave. He told me about the client he was meeting, a big architectural firm that could be a game-changing contract for his small construction company. I started it with my buddy from high school, he explained, rinsing the razor under the tap. It's been a grind, you know? A lot of late nights and cheap takeout. But this meeting, this could be it. The one that lets us finally hire a few more people and maybe even take a weekend off, he laughed, but I could hear the exhaustion and the hope in his voice. He was telling me about his dreams, right here in my bathroom. He was showing me a part of himself that I never would have seen in our brief hallway encounters. He was revealing a vulnerability, a passion for his work that I found incredibly attractive. He finished shaving and splashed his face with water, patting it dry with a hand towel I offered him. The nick on his jaw had stopped bleeding. He looked at himself in the mirror, turning his head from side to side. Not bad, he said, more to himself than to me. Then he turned to me, a genuine, warm smile spreading across his face. It wasn't the quick, polite smile from the hallway. This one was different. It was full of real gratitude and a new kind of familiarity. Seriously, Miles. Thank you. You really saved me. It was nothing, I said, and I meant it. In that moment, breaking my routine and navigating the initial awkwardness felt completely worth it. I felt a connection, a small but significant spark that warmed the quiet, lonely corners of my heart. As he handed the razor back, his hand closed over mine for a moment. It was a firm, warm grip, a simple, friendly gesture of thanks. But for me, it was everything. It was a small, significant moment that I knew I would be replaying in my mind for the rest of the day, and probably the rest of the week. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling, began to bloom in my chest. Just when I thought the strange, charged interlude was over, it took another turn. Caleb had finished rinsing his face and was getting ready to leave. I was already mentally preparing for the return to silence, for the moment the door would click shut behind him, leaving me alone with my racing heart and the lingering scent of his shaving cream. He had the towel in one hand and was about to head for the door. But then he paused. He looked back at my mirror, then at his reflection, then at me. A strange, hesitant expression crossed his face. You know, he said slowly, a hint of frustration creeping back into his voice. I think I made it worse. I frowned, confused. What do you mean? He gestured to a spot just under his jawline, an area that was hard to see head-on. This one spot. I can't seem to get the angle right with your mirror. It's smaller than mine, and I keep missing it, or I'm afraid I'm going to slice my own throat open. He let out a self-deprecating laugh, but it was tinged with genuine annoyance. I'm usually not this incompetent, I swear. He turned back to the mirror and tried again, contorting his neck at an awkward angle. My bathroom was, admittedly, compact. The mirror was directly over the sink, which forced a person to lean in at a slightly uncomfortable proximity. I watched him struggle for a moment, my brain trying to process what was happening. Part of me was screaming, just let him go. It's fine. He'll figure it out. But another, bolder part of me, a part one barely recognized, saw the situation for what it was, another opportunity, another extension of this bizarre and intimate moment. He sighed, putting the razor down on the counter with a clatter. This is hopeless, he muttered, sounding defeated. Then he looked at me. His eyes, a deep, warm brown, met mine in the reflection of the mirror. There was a beat of silence where the only sound was the drumming of the rain outside and the frantic pounding of my own heart. He gave a small, hesitant smile. This is going to be the weirdest thing I've ever asked a neighbor, he said, his voice dropping a little. But you seem to have a steady hand. Would you mind finishing it for me? Just that one spot. The air in the tiny bathroom suddenly felt thick and heavy, charged with a new kind of electricity. My mind went completely blank. Did he just ask what I thought he asked? He wanted me to shave him? It was an act of such profound trust, such startling intimacy, that it seemed to defy all logic. This was something a father might do for a son, or a long-term partner for another. It was not something a man asked of his quiet, gay neighbor he barely knew. Or was it? Was it possible that, to him, this was just a practical solution to a practical problem? A simple, bro moment devoid of any of the earth-shattering significance I was attaching to it. My internal conflict was a raging storm. Hope versus fear. The hope that this meant something, that he saw me in a way I hadn't dared to imagine. The fear that I was projecting all my own longing onto him, and that my acceptance would be met with confusion, or worse, revulsion once the line was crossed. But looking at his face, at the genuine, slightly embarrassed plea in his eyes, I couldn't say no. It felt like a test, a challenge from the universe. After a lifetime of retreating into my shell, of choosing safety over risk, here was a moment that demanded the opposite. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. Sure, I said. My voice came out as a whisper. I cleared my throat and tried again, aiming for casual. Yeah, no problem. Caleb's face flooded with relief. Oh man, thank you. Seriously, he picked up the can of shaving cream and put a small dab on his finger, applying it carefully to the patch of skin just under his jaw. He then turned to face me fully, his back to the mirror, and tilted his head up and to the side, exposing his neck, offering it to me. I picked up the razor. It felt impossibly heavy in my hand. I stepped closer, entering his personal space in a way that felt both forbidden and incredibly natural. The warmth radiating from his body washed over me. I could smell the clean scent of his skin mixed with the shaving cream. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I gently placed the fingers of my left hand on his jaw, cupping it to hold his head steady. His skin was warm and slightly rough with stubble. He didn't flinch. He just watched me, his eyes dark and unreadable. His Adam's apple bobbed once, a single, convulsive swallow. Time seemed to slow down. My entire universe shrank to the few inches of space between us. I could feel the steady thrum of his pulse beneath my fingertips. I brought the razor to his skin, my movements slow and deliberate. I was terrified of cutting him, of breaking the spell of the moment. I drew the blade down in one smooth, careful stroke, clearing away the last of the foam. The sound of the blade against his stubble was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. I did it again, another clean stroke, until the spot was smooth. I kept my hand on his jaw for a second too long, my thumb stroking almost unconsciously against his skin. His eyes were locked on mine, and in their depths, I saw something shift. The gratitude was still there, but it was mingling with something else, something deeper and more intense. It was a look of raw, unguarded vulnerability. It was a question, and I had no idea what the answer was. I pulled my hand away as if I'd been burned, my composure shattering. I took a step back, putting a safe distance between us again. There, I said, my voice hoarse. All done. Caleb slowly lowered his head, his gaze never leaving my face. He reached up and touched the spot I had just shaved, his fingers tracing the now smooth skin. He didn't say anything for a long moment. The silence was deafening, crackling with unspoken words and feelings that were too new and too fragile to name. He looked from me to the razor I still held in my hand, then back to me. A faint flush had risen on his cheeks. Thanks, Miles, he said, his voice low and thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the bathroom, out of my apartment, leaving me standing alone, trembling, with the ghost of his skin still warm on my fingertips. The door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed in was heavier and more profound than any I had ever known. In the immediate aftermath, my apartment felt both cavernously empty and electrically charged. The air was still thick with the scent of his shaving cream, a ghostly reminder of his presence. I stood frozen in the bathroom for what felt like an eternity, staring at my own wide-eyed reflection in the mirror. My heart was still hammering against my ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm that echoed the turmoil in my mind. I looked down at my hand, the one that had held his jaw. It was trembling slightly. I could still feel the phantom sensation of his skin, the warmth, the faint roughness of his stubble, the shocking intimacy of his pulse beneath my thumb. The mundane had collided with the profound, and I was left reeling in the wreckage. I replayed the entire scene in my head, again and again, like a film critic searching for meaning in every frame. His initial frantic knock, his embarrassed explanation, the easy conversation as he shaved, and then the turning point, the request, the look in his eyes as I held his face in my hand. Every detail was magnified, analyzed, and scrutinized until it lost all shape and meaning. My mind, usually a tool for logic and order, had become a feedback loop of hope and anxiety. What did it mean? That was the question that screamed in the silence of my apartment. The rational part of my brain tried to assert itself, offering up logical, non-threatening explanations. He was in a hurry. He was stressed. He couldn't see properly in my smaller mirror. It was a simple, pragmatic request between two neighbors. A weird but ultimately meaningless bro moment. Men do strange, tactile things sometimes that don't carry the same weight they would for me. He probably hadn't thought twice about it the second he walked out the door. He was straight, after all. I had decided that on day one. But then the other part of my brain, the hopeful, lonely part, would whisper its own narrative. It would focus on the way he looked at me in the mirror, the way his breath hitched when I first touched him, the way his Adam's apple bobbed, the charged silence that hung between us before he left. These weren't pragmatic details. They were emotional data points, hints of something deeper lurking beneath the surface. This part of my brain dared to imagine that the intimacy of the moment was not just one-sided. It dared to hope that he had felt it, too. This internal debate was exhausting. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, unable to concentrate on my work. Every line of code I tried to write, every design element I tried to place, seemed to mock my distraction. My meticulously ordered world had been thrown into chaos by a 5-minute encounter. Hope and fear were at war within me, and it was a battle that left me drained and on edge. Hope was a fragile, beautiful thing, but fear was a formidable opponent, armed with years of self-protection and the deep-seated belief that I was not the kind of person that men like Caleb noticed. The next few days were excruciating. The casual, easy neighborliness we had started to build was gone, replaced by a tense, awkward awareness. The hallway, once a neutral space, became a minefield of potential encounters. On Wednesday, I heard his door open at the same time as mine. My stomach plummeted. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, and waited until I heard the sound of his footsteps fading toward the elevator before I dared to step out. It was cowardly, I knew, but I couldn't face him. I had no idea what I would say, what my face would betray. On Thursday, we weren't so lucky. I was coming back from a coffee run, and as I stepped out of the elevator, he was walking toward it. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw a flash of something in his expression, surprise, or maybe the same anxiety I was feeling. Before he looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor in front of him. He gave a clipped, barely audible "hey" as we passed each other. I muttered a hi back to my own shoes. The air between us was thick with the unspoken memory of what had happened in my bathroom. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was a heavy blanket smothering any potential for connection. Each non-interaction was another piece of evidence for the prosecution. Fear was winning the case. See, my brain told me. He's weirded out. He regrets it. He realized you're gay and he crossed some line he didn't intend to, and now he's avoiding you. He thinks you're a creep who read way too much into it. The narrative of rejection was so compelling, so familiar, that it was almost a comfort to fall back into it. It was a painful story, but at least it was one I knew the ending to. Yet, even as I resigned myself to this conclusion, a tiny, stubborn spark of hope refused to be extinguished. It replayed the softness in his eyes. It replayed the way he had offered his trust so completely. It whispered that maybe, just maybe, his awkwardness wasn't born of regret, but of the same confusing, overwhelming emotions that were churning inside of me. Maybe he was just as lost as I was, navigating this new, uncharted territory between us without a map. That possibility was terrifying, but it was also the only thing that kept me from completely shutting down. The aftermath of our moment had created a chasm between us, and I was just standing on the edge, too afraid to fall, but unable to walk away. The tension stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was in reality only 3 days. 3 days of hallway avoidance, of strained silence, of my own relentless internal monologue. I had nearly convinced myself to accept the worst-case scenario, that I had imagined everything, that our brief connection had been an illusion, and that our relationship would now be defined by this permanent, awkward distance. I was mourning something that had never even really existed. I was getting ready to file the entire experience away in the cabinet of things that weren't meant to be, when another knock came at my door. It was Friday evening. I was trying to lose myself in a movie, but my focus was shot. When the knock came, it was soft this time, hesitant. Not at all like the frantic rapping from Tuesday morning. My heart leaped into my throat. I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that it was him. I muted the television and walked to the door on legs that felt unsteady. I took a deep breath, braced myself for, I did not know what. Another awkward apology? A request to please forget the whole thing ever happened? I opened the door. Caleb was standing there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He wasn't looking at me, but at the scuffed toes of his work boots. He looked profoundly nervous, a stark contrast to the confident man I first met. The silence stretched for a moment before he finally looked up, his brown eyes meeting mine. They were filled with an earnest, anxious sincerity. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. Can we talk for a minute?" I nodded, my throat too tight to form words, and stepped back to let him in. He walked into my living room, but remained standing in the middle of the rug, as if he were an intruder. The air was thick with all the things we hadn't said for the past 3 days. I closed the door and turned to face him, my arms crossed over my chest in a defensive posture I wasn't even aware I was taking. He started, then stopped, running a hand over the back of his neck. It was a gesture I was beginning to recognize as his tell for when he was nervous. "Look, Miles," he began, his gaze fixed on a spot over my shoulder. "I've been a complete idiot this week. Avoiding you in the hall, being all weird. I'm sorry. It's just, I haven't known what to say." I waited, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. "The other day," he continued, finally forcing himself to look at me. "In your bathroom. I need to be honest about that. Here it comes," I thought. The "let's pretend it never happened" speech. The "I'm not gay," but clarification. I steeled myself for the impact. But what he said next was not what I expected at all. "My razor wasn't broken," he said, the words coming out in a rush. I blinked, processing his statement. "What? My razor?" he repeated, his voice steadier now. "It's fine. It was never broken. I made it up." He finally looked me directly in the eye, and what I saw there was not regret, but a raw, terrifying vulnerability. I wanted an excuse to talk to you. A real excuse, you know? Not just about the weather or the elevator. And it was the dumbest thing I could think of in the moment. My mind was reeling. He had fabricated the entire emergency. The whole frantic, mid-shave panic was a ruse. He'd put shaving cream on half his face and knocked on my door just to have a reason to interact with me. It was the most absurd, convoluted, and strangely romantic thing I had ever heard. A small, incredulous laugh escaped my lips. You faked a shaving emergency?" I asked, the sheer ridiculousness of it breaking through my anxiety. A slow smile touched his lips, though his eyes remained serious. "Yeah, pretty lame, huh? I've been wanting to ask you out since the day I moved in, but I just kept losing my nerve. I'd see you, and I'd have this whole speech planned, and then you'd just look at me with those quiet, observant eyes, and all my words would just fly away." He took a hesitant step closer. "And then the thing with asking you to finish, that wasn't planned. I just got in there and I was so nervous, and I couldn't leave, and it just came out. It was probably way too much, and I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. The second I walked out your door, I was terrified I had completely blown it. Every fear I had harbored, every narrative of rejection I had written, dissolved in that moment." His awkwardness wasn't about him being weirded out by me. It was about him being terrified of his own feelings, of my reaction. He was just as lost in this as I was. All the anxiety and tension that had been coiled in my stomach for days finally unspooled, replaced by a wave of overwhelming relief and a soaring, brilliant hope. "You didn't make me uncomfortable," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what it meant." He took another step, closing the distance between us. We were standing only a foot apart now, in the middle of my living room, the quiet hum of the city outside the only sound. "It meant," he said, his voice low and full of a feeling that was now unmistakable, "that I'm falling for you, Miles. It meant I was looking for any excuse to be close to you." He searched my face, looking for an answer, and I realized I didn't need words to give him one. I finally let my arms fall to my sides, uncrossing the barrier I had put up between us. I met his gaze, and I let him see all the hope, all the longing, all the feeling I had kept hidden for so long. And that was all the confirmation he needed. He closed the last bit of distance between us, raised a hand to cup my cheek. Not my jaw this time, but my cheek, and he kissed me. It wasn't tentative or questioning like the moment in the bathroom. It was confident and sure, and full of all the words we hadn't known how to say. It was a kiss that felt like a confession and a promise and a beginning, all at once. And I kissed him back, finally letting go of all my fear and leaning into the hope of what was to come. That confession, that first real kiss in my living room, was the start of everything. It felt like the world had shifted on its axis, or rather, like it had finally settled into its correct alignment. The awkward tension that had defined our last few days evaporated instantly, replaced by a comfortable, exciting intimacy. We spent the rest of that Friday night just talking, really talking, for the first time. We sat on my sofa, not quite touching but incredibly aware of each other's proximity, and unraveled the stories of our lives that couldn't be gleaned from hallway pleasantries. He told me about growing up in a small town, about the pressure to fit a certain mold, and about the slow, confusing journey to understanding and accepting who he was. He admitted that moving to the city was a chance to start fresh, to be himself without the weight of lifelong expectations. I, in turn, told him about my quiet life, my love for order, and the loneliness that had become such a familiar companion. It was strange how easily the words came, how comfortable it felt to be vulnerable with him. It was as if that one, absurdly intimate moment with the razor had fast-forwarded us past all the usual small talk and straight to the heart of things. Our first official date was 2 days later. He took me to a tiny Italian restaurant tucked away on a side street I had walked past 100 times but never noticed. It was perfect. The conversation flowed as easily as it had on my sofa. We talked about everything and nothing, our favorite movies, our worst jobs, our dreams for the future. I learned that the tough, construction worker exterior hid a man who loved old black and white films and had a surprising talent for sketching. He learned that my quiet, introverted nature hid a deeply passionate person who cared immensely about the people in his life. In the weeks and months that followed, our two separate lives began to merge in small, beautiful ways. His muddy work boots started appearing by my front door. My ridiculously expensive coffee beans found a permanent home in his kitchen cabinet. My quiet apartment was no longer always silent. It was often filled with his easy laughter or the sound of the terrible action movies he loved to watch. And I found that I didn't mind the disruption to my routine. In fact, I welcomed it. He brought a warmth and a spontaneous joy to my life that I hadn't even realized was missing. We fell into a rhythm that was all our own. He'd come over after a long day at work, smelling of sawdust and sweat, and I'd have dinner ready. I, in turn, would sometimes find myself a little less focused on my work, my thoughts drifting to him, wondering about his day. He introduced me to his friends, a loud, boisterous group that welcomed me without question. I introduced him to the quiet pleasures of my world, the peacefulness of a rainy Sunday spent reading, the satisfaction of a perfectly designed web page. We were different in so many ways, but our core values, our kindness, our desire for a genuine connection, they aligned perfectly. One evening, about 2 months after that first kiss, I was in my bathroom when Caleb came in. He was getting ready to shave before we went out for dinner. He lathered up his face, picked up his razor, his own, fully functional razor, and caught my eye in the mirror. A slow, mischievous grin spread across his face. "You know," he said, tapping a spot under his jaw, "I've got this one spot that's always really tricky to get." I laughed, a full, happy sound that bounced off the tiled walls. I walked up behind him and wrapped my arms around his waist, resting my chin on his shoulder and looking at our reflection together. "Oh, really?" I said, playing along. "And I suppose you need some help with that?" He leaned back against me, the warmth of his body seeping into mine. I might, he said, his voice soft. I seem to recall you have a very steady hand. In the mirror, I saw two men smiling, their reflections intertwined. The awkwardness of that first encounter was gone, replaced by a deep, comfortable love. It was a perfect callback, a sweet reminder of the ridiculous, terrifying, wonderful moment that started it all. I never could have predicted that my quiet, ordered life would be so completely and beautifully overturned by a man who faked a shaving emergency. It's funny, isn't it? We spend so much time building walls to protect ourselves, curating our lives to minimize risk and avoid pain. We stick to routines, we keep a safe distance, we convince ourselves that we are content with solitude. But true connection, the kind of love that reshapes your world, doesn't happen in the safe zone. It happens when you take a risk. It happens when you open the door to a frantic, half-shaved man and say yes to the unexpected. It's found in the moments of vulnerability, in the courage it takes to confess your fears and your feelings. My life with Caleb is a daily reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things are waiting for you just on the other side of a door you were afraid to open. And all it takes is one moment of bravery, one shared look in a mirror, to change everything forever.